Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's broadcast of Fighters, Coaches, and Fathers. My guest today is the original coach of welterweight champion, Rory MacDonald. David Lee, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing good, Geoff. I'm actually the current coach for Rory, too. Just a lot of people don't realize that. He's in Montreal, but since leaving the UFC, I've been his head coach again.
Excellent. Talk to me a little bit about that transition, because there seems to be management, there seems to be UFC, there seems to be Bellator. Talk to me a little bit about, you know what? Let's come back to that because I want to discuss that. Thank you for doing that. But I want to talk about you right now. Tell me a little bit about David, and tell me a little bit about your parents, how you grew up in your journey into martial arts.
It's a pretty typical story, really. The main thing is my dad was a student for most of my childhood. He was getting his PhD in psychology, and as a result, we moved a lot. I'd lived in 7 different cities and moved 17 times by the time I was hitting junior high school. So I was really always the new kid, you know what I mean? And so with being the new kid all the time, you got really good at 2 things. One is you got good at making friends fast because you're always kind of coming in and blowing into town. And you also got to meet every bully real quick. So with that sort of social experiment, you get pretty good at realizing that you need to know how to protect yourself. My dad also lived in Japan for a couple of years when he was a young man. So I always kind of was sort of drawn to that Asian culture. It was just one of those things, we grew up, we had, katanas around the house, we had traditional kimonos. So I was always drawn to that culture. I think naturally just because of my dad's experience there. But yeah, it was, I discovered that I needed martial arts pretty early on in my life.
So you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but were you a big fan of Sho Kosugi and ninjutsu, and did you have the boots and the swords and everything too, like I did? Or
yeah, being a child of the 80s, everybody, we were all ninjas and we were all karate kids, definitely.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw that ad on or that news story on Facebook that was completely false last week about how they're running out of ninjas somewhere in Japan. A whole bunch of people put them out there. So I waited a bit before I put my application in just to see if it's true. So it's not true. They don't need us.
Yeah. A lot of broken heart ninjas out there now.
That's awesome. So were all the cities that you moved to, were they all in Canada or?
No, actually, we lived down in States for a short time. And ironically, that was by far the most violent area that I've lived as a child.
Which part?
Well, and this is the funny part, is it was actually Denver, Colorado. So you would think, oh, Denver, right? It's like the Calgary of the States. But it was actually, we lived in low income housing down there. And I was a minority down in that area of where we lived. And it was actually surprisingly quite a violent area.
Interesting. And that can start to put you in situations sometimes that can shape you as you move forward.
Yeah, definitely. You're dealing with a lot of conflict resolution at a very early age. And, I was quite young at the time. So for me, I spent a good part of that time down there in sort of a constant state of fight or flight.
Interesting. And so you spoke about your dad spending some time in Japan and bringing back the culture and being a child of the 80s, and we're all like little ninjas. Talk to me when it started to sort of solidify for you and it started to become a real passion for you.
Yeah, I mean, it was, throughout my life off and on, it was always sort of there, like everybody. I had a yellow belt in Taekwondo, when I was a little kid. I was doing Kung Fu and, really anything I could get my hands on. I didn't have a real consistent training until I was in my later teens. And I had stuck with Taekwondo for a few years at that time. Everything was traditional martial arts really before 93, before the UFC hit. So I was actually helping teach Taekwondo at a Boys and Girls Club in Kelowna. in my late teens, early 20s. And then in 93, UFC one happened down in Denver, ironically. And then the rest has sort of been history since then.
Interesting. So you are training in Taekwondo. You're in Kelowna. 93 comes around. You start seeing the UFC, and like so many other people, you start going, "What is going on? What is Royce Gracie? How does that little guy beat that big guy?" And how does the path start to form for you then?
It was. I mean, it really was. It was like it was like seeing a Martian for the first time. I didn't know what was going on. I had no idea what this grappling stuff was. It was literally completely foreign to me, completely foreign. At the time, though, however, I was already doing some cross training. So even at that time in Taekwondo, I really felt there was limitations, even though I didn't know what those limitations were. And so I was training with a lot of, we were training with boxers and kung fu guys and kind of anybody that would be willing to train with us. We kind of had a little bit of a side thing going with our training. So to try to find knowledge in the grappling thing was a pretty natural progression for us because we were already kind of on this sort of search, if you will. But yeah, finding information though, that was the tricky part. In 93, there wasn't a single black belt in all of Canada. I think Marcus Soares was the first black belt in Canada, and I believe he came over around 90, what would he have been, 97 or 96 maybe when he arrived, maybe even later than that, I'm not sure. So, when I finally found a jiu-jitsu club, it was a Japanese jiu-jitsu club, but it was the closest thing that I could find. It actually said jiu-jitsu on the door.
Yeah.
Other than that, there was not a lot of similarities, but it was kind of my first step into that sort of grappling realm. And I received my black belt in Japanese jiu-jitsu, but I still knew it was not what I was looking for. It was still very traditional, very cooperative in training. And then I finally found a purple belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and a purple belt back then in the mid 90s. I mean, he was a god,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I found a purple belt, got connected through there. It was a guy in Vernon actually named Jason Dara, and then I met my first black belt, John Della O, back then through him, and it just bounced around, man. Back then, everybody, if you were Canadian and you were a martial artist trying to learn, you just did what we all did. You traveled, you brought guys to you went to seminars, you watched fights, and you really, it was a slow process, but we sure created some amazing martial artists out of that process.
Yeah, it's a similar story about that. They say, Brian Bird talks the same way.
Yeah.
Mean talks the same way. Curtis Brigham, all you guys sort of like along that same path and going through that. And each one of you as coaches have really had the opportunity to have very, very special students as well as being yourselves very, very talented. Tell me a little bit about meeting Rory. Well, tell me a little bit of creating your school for the first time.
Again, it was just really a natural growth for me as a martial artist. There was just nobody anywhere in the area that was doing what I wanted to do as a martial artist. It just really came down to that. So I opened up my club more for my own development. I wanted to teach a specific style. I wanted to have training partners so that I could progress. And that's really how it began. It's really an incredible journey since then because it really has taken on a life of its own that goes way beyond myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And to have such success with Rory MacDonald, how did he end up at your club?
It's a story that's been told. His older brother Ryan was in a high school class, like a PE class, that came and just tried a free class at Toshido, and his brother had spoken pretty highly of it. He'd enjoyed himself, and he was in a car with Rory, who was 14 at the time, and their dad, and they were talking about this, this MMA gym, this fight gym. And their dad was watching UFC with these guys a lot already at that point, and they were big fans of the sport. And he's like, okay, well, I'm going to drop you off. And that was pretty much it. He just pulled up, kicked him out of the car, said, go check it out. And then that was it. You know, Rory was a hockey kid at the time, and the passion of MMA completely took over.
Yeah, when we talked to Curtis Brigham about Brad Katona and some of the other guys, and it's always interesting to, and then we talked to Brian Bird about some of his pros, Nick Ring, Hakeem, who's fighting this Saturday, and some of his new guys, Chad and Hilliger. When you talk to them, they always specifically talk about work ethic and that passion, which I think you're talking about too, David, in terms of how he made that switch. Was that true with Rory, and was there something else about him that seemed different?
You know, I've been training fighters for 20 years now, and you know, which is a long time in this game. You know, really long time, and I've come to discover, you know, regardless of the name of the person, you know, it could be Rory, it could be, you know, one of our other guys that have been in the UFC or Bellator or even in the regional shows. What makes guys really succeed is they have a combination of a few attributes. There's lots of people that are very strong in one attribute, and whether it's focus or natural talent or determination or whatever. And that's enough to get you pretty far regionally. The guys that are doing well on the world stage are guys, they have it all. They've got the focus, they've got the work ethic, they've got the drive, and there's also a little bit of luck involved in these guys. I mean, the fact is that every one of these athletes is one injury away from their career being over, you know, which is a pretty intense thought. But I've seen many high-level guys. Like Rory was my first guy that I got in the UFC. We've had 4 people in the UFC out of my little gym, and a couple in Bellator as well. And you know, it's incredible to watch. You know, just the timing is huge, and you can control a lot of things, but you can't control timing. And so a lot of these guys that are, you know, like, they get injured and then they lose a fight, and before you know it, they're kind of getting, you know, knocked back down, you know, the rankings. And then you've got guys where they go on like a 3-fight win streak at the right time in their career, and then boom, suddenly they're in the UFC. So it's, you know, there's so many factors to being successful in fighting. But the one thing that every single one of those guys at that level has is they've got unbelievable focus and they've got unbelievable drive. You know, I would ask Rory, like, you know, at 17, you know, it would be his birthday. And I'd be, you know, so what's going on tonight? What are you doing for your birthday? And he's like, well, what do you think? I'm training. You know, that was sort of his attitude, right? And really, that's what separated him from a lot of other guys. Because I had other guys that were as talented as Rory that could have been, you know, I had a couple of guys, Bobby Shabaga, Tim Jensen, Gary. These are all guys that easily could have been in the UFC, easily, talent-wise. But life got in the way. You know, the timing wasn't right, injuries at the wrong time, family stuff, you know, distractions. And Rory was the first one that didn't allow life to sort of sidetrack him. And that's why he was my first guy in.
It's amazing. But I remember being at that UFC, and when Rory fought Carlos Condit, and we were like, oh, who's this young kid? Was he 18 or 19 or 20 or something in that fight? And we were sitting there going, how did this guy get the fight? We never heard of him. And then his performance going up against Carlos Condit, who at that time I think was probably one of the top welterweights in his division, unbelievable. And Rory's all over him, winning round 1 and winning round 2, and basically was up in round 3. And like, before we get into that fight, talk to me about, was that just the call? Hey, was it a late replacement? How did that fight come about?
No, you know, it was a surprising fight offer, honestly. I got Rory signed. It was just after his 19th birthday, I believe, when he got signed, or maybe just turning 20, maybe. But anyways, he was the youngest kid on the roster in the UFC at the time, and we brought him in, and he came in, and his debut was against Mike Guyman, who was another King of the Cage champion at the time, or, you know, just prior to getting signed to the UFC. And he dispatched Mike Guyman quite quickly with an arm lock. And Mike was a Jiu-Jitsu black belt at the time, and so it was a eye opener for the UFC, is especially because they'd heard about Rory, and there's a lot of hype going in, with him being a young guy that was sort of the first sort of well-rounded MMA fighter. So anyways, I got the call, and they had just brought Carlos Condit over from the WEC to challenge GSP for the belt. That was why Condit was brought over, was he was a legit contender for the belt. And so when they offered this fight with Rory, I was, to be honest with you, I thought it was way too early for Rory, in his career. That was his second UFC fight. The guy was still, basically a teenager. And, but Rory, Rory's never backed down from a challenge in his life, and he really wanted that test. And I knew that it was a winnable fight for Rory, because unlike most people who had never heard of him, I saw what Rory was doing in the gym, and I knew what he was capable of. But yeah, it was a bit early in his career for that fight, in my opinion. But I'm not going to get in the way of somebody else's, their journey. You know what I mean? I can guide them, but at the end of the day, they're their own men, and they got to make those decisions.
Yeah, and it was an amazing event to be in that crowd, because for us who didn't know who it was, and you could tell the vibe and the pride that we were feeling, like, who is this Canadian kid who is rocking a WC champion all around the place? And that must have felt really good. And I also want to make one thing very clear to some of our viewers here. When you talk about training fighters for 20 years and you talk about being in Kelowna specifically, people don't realize that the population of Kelowna is like, I don't know, 120,000 people. Like, it's not like a big city where you have these natural people that sort of rise to the cream of the crop because of competition. There just isn't that amount. No. So there really has to be something else there. And I think that Toshido, your club, has done an exceptional job developing the talent in people doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's awesome. So he signed Rory, moves from there. So he gets that fight, and you're sitting there. You got to be over the moon. You got to be proud. I imagine Rory's pissed off. Like, he just seems like he was upset because he had that fight. But what happens after?
It was like I said, it was literally getting thrown into the deep end. Just beyond the actual fight itself, the experience was incredible. I've been part of Rory's career now since he was 14. He just turned 29. So that's 15 years that I've been a part of Rory's life and his career from day one. Even to this day, I've never heard a crowd react the way it did in that Vancouver show. His Bellator world title fight, his UFC world title fight against Lawler, all those. Nothing compares to the crowd response from his second UFC fight. I couldn't even talk to him in between rounds. It was just too loud. The crowd was so crazy that literally I was screaming from a couple inches away, and Rory couldn't hear me. I can't imagine what was going through that kid's mind at that time. He had been fighting in King of the Cage in banquet halls, to now fighting at GM Place in Vancouver. And he was really, he was the main event at that show, even though he wasn't, but the crowd treated him like he was the GSP.
And everyone was talking about it the next day, right? Or right after, like, did you see that kid, Rory MacDonald? Where's he training? Or what's going on? Yeah. Did you see a lot of people start banging down your doors at Toshido after that, even though it's small population?
Yeah, it's weird. The having high level fighters is a double-edged sword for an actual club owner. It's people love it. I get people stopping by and asking questions, and fans, but a lot of people find that it's a bit intimidating. So when you've got somebody who wants to just be a recreational martial artist, it's funny. I'll have guys will be like, "Yeah, I'm coming to Toshido, but I'm going to train at this place first to learn a little bit first." I'm like, "No, man, like, just come, and learn. We've got grandmothers that train with us. It's not just Rory MacDonald's and Matt Dwyer's, and you know what I mean. We've got we train 4-year-olds, and we train people that are in their 70s. But it's still, obviously, I wouldn't change my experiences. I wouldn't change for the world. I've traveled the world with this sport, and have had incredible experiences.
I love the way that you said that, David, talking about that double-edged sword, because I've been to Kelowna a number of times. I think it's like a really pretty Regina, Saskatchewan, where I'm originally from. And fighting always you often get an interesting type of character that may show up. And I'm always curious about an event because, I mean, the Gracies used to do challenge matches. We used to do them back in the day. Okay, well, let's do whatever you're going to do and go from there. And sometimes that would have a desired effect, and you would earn the respect. Was there after? I mean, I'm not sure of this, but after that type of thing, my assumption would be that there might be some characters coming to the club that wanted to be tough guys, and I think each coach and manager has to deal with that in a very specific way. How did you deal with that?
That has changed a lot over my maturity level. So when I first opened up the gym 20 years ago, you're right. The environment was a lot different back then. So, if somebody talked a big talk and came in and they wanted to prove themselves, I was very happy to oblige. I loved it. Right? Yeah, sure. Let's see how good your kung fu is or whatever. And I was quite happy to test myself and let them test themselves. As I've gotten older, that environment's changed a lot. Everything's much more professional now. People are much more, what's the word? Civilized. I suppose that's the word. People feel a lot more, there's not a lot of consequences for people's bad behavior now. Everybody's very protected as far as that goes. I think the social media was a big part of that. People are just used to acting very crass and disrespectful with not a lot of backlash. That's why sometimes when it happens in the real world and somebody gets a slap in the mouth, everybody kind of stops and gasps. But no, I mean, we had a lot more of those sort of weird challenges in the beginning. A lot of people were very, still wanted to prove that their style was formidable. But the sport's long past that. It's evolved way past that. There's no more style versus style anymore. And now when people come in, it tends to be people that are people that need help more than a good sparring session.
Yeah. I totally agree, and well said. Now, you just had a fairly number of fighters, Chris Day, Matt Dwyer, in an event out in Penticton, and we were talking a little bit about that before we got started. Talk to me a little bit about that event, how it started, because I know it can be a little bit tough sometimes getting events in BC, and how it ended up.
So we had a record-breaking weekend. So the last Okanagan show, I believe, was in 2012. It was BFL, which is a Vancouver-based promotion, and they came into Penticton and put on a show. And we had 5 guys fighting on that show, and had 5 victories. It was an amazing night. We were thrilled. It's still one of my and one of the highlights that I look fondly back on. But there hadn't been a show in the Okanagan in a long time, so we're traveling everywhere, and which is fine. It's part of the sport. But I really wanted to do another local show, so I started to lay the groundwork down. After talking with the BC Athletic Commission, it became pretty apparent early on that if I was to promote the show, I wouldn't be able to properly prepare my fighters because there'd be some conflict of interest there as far as that went. So I was actually down in Texas at the UFC trying to sort of figure this out, and had some time on my hands, as you do often during fight week. And so I approached Darren Cliffe from the XFFC. We had recently been up there at another show, and he had expressed some interest in doing a show in the interior down here. And I said, look, I've got the venue, the Athletic Commission has okayed the date. I've even got a financial backer. Would you be interested in taking it over? And he was interested. So fast forward a few months, and now we've got 10 people fighting. We had a Toshido fighter in every single fight. So we had 10 guys on. Insane. I mean, I barely even went to the back. I kind of was pretty much just perched in the corner for the whole night. Kind of walked back and forward, back and forth. And we had we smashed our record of 5 victories completely. We had 9 victories in one night. Matt Dwyer knocked out UFC veteran Dominic Steele for the XFFC middleweight title. An unbelievable night, and one that we're going to remember for a very long time.
Yeah, congratulations. I think that's a real dream. I don't think I can even think of another time.
Yeah.
Even in jiu-jitsu where someone dominated to that level with that amount of people.
Yeah. And these were all pro fights against very formidable opponents. It was really important for us to challenge ourselves, even though we were in front of our hometown. And, so all of our opponents, I would say 90% of them had, at the very least, much more experience than our guys. And, but yeah, every fight was just unbelievable. It was the best fight card I've seen as far as a regional fight card. I've never seen that many exciting fights before on one card.
Anything different, or is it just the same system Toshido's always done moving into? I mean, I guess if you're 5 for 5 and 1 and 9 out of 10 and 1, was there anything? I mean, you got to change a little, don't you?
Well, we're always evolving. You have to. The sport is not the same now as it was, even 3 years ago. It is really it's a constant race to try to keep up. But that being said, martial arts, especially in a non-cooperative nature, which MMA certainly is, you just have to be really good at the basics. You have to be good at the basics. You can do well with some of the fancy stuff and you can catch guys off guard. But if you want to have a long, successful career, you've got to have those basics down. It's kind of like just, basic military rules, right? Keep it simple, stupid. The guys that have got the meat and potato techniques down to a science are the guys that are going to, they'll do well for a long time in their career.
That's good to hear. Can we play a little bit of word association right now?
Sure, throw them at me, buddy.
Maybe like UFC, Bellator. Like, what's the difference between the two organizations from a coach like yourself?
Ooh, wow, yeah, it's tough because UFC is king. There's just no doubt about it. People understand the UFC. They've branded like nobody, they're as branded as Coca-Cola, and they've done a lot. They've spent a lot of money to make sure that happens. Bellator reminds me of the UFC right after the dark days of the UFC, where they're kind of coming out into their own. They've got their stars that they're pushing, and they're starting to spend some money. So, I don't know if Bellator is catching up or what, but I'll tell you right now, both of those companies are putting out amazing products right now, and some of the fights coming out for both those guys are some of the most exciting fights that this sport has ever seen. The Rory Musasi fight coming up in September. You've got champ versus champ, two of the arguably the best at their weight going at it. Man, if you're not excited for that fight, I don't think you're a fan of the sport.
Yeah. Now we'd have some fun here. 19-year-old daughter, 6-year-old son.
Yeah. And same mom. A lot of people assume that it's a different mom. No, look, I had a system.
Go on.
That system worked for 14 years. And apparently one slipped past the goalie. So yeah, that was a surprise. I hit 40 years old and my wife said, we need to talk. Yeah, my daughter was not impressed.
Well, I hear that, and I know you have two beautiful kids, and it looks like Noah's doing some wrestling now. Did he just win a medal recently at 6, 7?
Yeah. He had his first Jiu-Jitsu tournament down at the BC Provincials. The CBJJF put on a great tournament down there on the coast. And Noah, he's my little 5-year-old. Well, 6. He just turned 6 this week. But yeah, he had his first tournament and took home the gold. It was pretty exciting.
I'm always curious, David, talking about, and congratulations, and that's awesome, and he's adorable. I'm always curious about the difference between training adults and teenagers, and then kids, because there's emotional maturity throughout that whole thing. Is there a formula to dealing with different types of ages? Do you have to be consistent across the board?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest difference with how I treat the kids, and I've been I've been training kids as long as I've been training fighters, is for the kids, I want to give them, when we have a training session, I want to give them information that they can use every day. Punching and kicking and grappling, very, important for confidence, great stress relief, but they're not using, if they're using their punching and kicking and grappling every day in real life, I'd say that they've got a bit of a problem that goes beyond, being surrounded by bullies. But we go into a lot of leadership building in the kids program, talking about honesty and integrity and discipline and follow through and setting goals. And those are the things that the parents really enjoy, and that the kids are using on a daily basis. And those are parts of the martial arts that a lot of people don't necessarily attribute to the martial arts, but it's a big part of our program.
Interesting. Now, let's go way back, and I like to ask this question of everybody on the podcast, and that question would be, tell me a story about, or maybe one of the greatest lessons that you learned from your parents.
I would say hands down, from my parents, it's integrity. My parents are probably the most honest people I've ever met in any walk of life. And let me give you a story to explain. It's almost to an outrageous level.
It'd be tough growing up, wouldn't it?
almost to a fault. So this is how honest my parents are. And this is a story with my mom specifically, but my mom was at my parents were in Europe, I believe, on a vacation. My mom returned home to Canada, and I'm pretty sure it was Europe. Maybe, they were in China too, but wherever. Anyway, she came home, realized that she had a wire coat hanger that from the hotel. So she actually packaged up that 3-cent wire coat hanger and spent the money and mailed it back to the hotel.
In Europe? Yeah,
Europe or wherever they were.
Wow.
So because she felt completely guilty that she ended up with this coat hanger in her luggage. So so that's the level of honesty. Like my mom is the kind of lady that would drive back to a grocery store if she realized that they forgot to charge her for bananas. You know what I mean? And so, with that kind of almost OCD level of honesty, it certainly has brushed off on me, and and I've always tried to treat people fairly and honestly in all my dealings.
Integrity. That's awesome. David Lee, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to me. If anybody wants to learn more information about Toshido, your school in Kelowna, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Probably like Facebook. We're on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram. We have a website, toshido.ca, and check it out. A lot of people don't realize we, in this little club in this little city that has no real, it's got no wrestling, it's got no foundation in anything. We've produced more MMA champions and have had more fighters in the in UFC and Bellator than any other club in the country, west of TriStar. So, we've done some amazing things that, we're very proud of here, and we like to share that with people. So, you can contact us anytime, come down, train, have fun with the guys. You'll be treated well.
Perfect. Well, thanks for taking the time, and I look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Awesome, buddy. Thank you very much. And I enjoyed talking with you today, Geoff.
Thanks so much. Bye for now.